Somewhere beneath the murky waters of the Gulf of Mexico, buried under sand and sediment deeper than a 10-story building, the ruins of an ancient city lie in almost perfect silence, completely forgotten by the modern world, waiting to be rediscovered by people who understand the evidence and know where to look. This city wasn't built by the civilizations we learn about in history class, not the Egyptians, not the Mesopotamians, not the Maya or the Aztecs, but by people who walked across a landscape that no longer exists, people who thrived in a world so different from ours that it might as well have been another planet. 10,000 years ago, the Gulf of Mexico looked almost nothing like it does today, and along its shores stood settlements that housed thousands of people, all of them connected by trade networks and shared cultures, all of them living in the shadow of a climate catastrophe that was about to reshape human civilization forever. The question that keeps us awake at night isn't just whether this ancient city existed, we have the evidence, but rather what happened to it, and more importantly, what was it like to live there when the world was still wild and vast and unmeasured by human boundaries? To understand the mystery of this sunken city, we have to go back, way back, to a time when ice ruled the world and the ocean itself was smaller and shallower and emptier than anyone alive today has ever seen it. The last ice age reached its maximum expansion about 20,000 years ago, and when it did, something remarkable happened to the entire planet. So much water got trapped in the glaciers and ice sheets that the sea level dropped dramatically, falling nearly 400 feet below where it sits today. Imagine standing on a beach somewhere in the Gulf, and instead of seeing water touching the shore, you see land stretching out before you, mile after mile, extending so far that the horizon seems to swallow the world itself. This exposed land wasn't barren desert or frozen tundra, but a rolling landscape covered in grasslands and forests and wetlands, crossed by rivers and streams that flowed toward a coastline that lay many miles away from where the current coast sits now. Archaeologists call this the continental shelf, a vast plain that drops off steeply into the deep ocean, and when sea levels were lower, it became habitable real estate that stretched across an area the size of several modern states combined. The climate of this Ice Age world was cooler than today, but not uniformly cold everywhere, because the Gulf region, being further south, stayed warmer than lands to the north, where massive ice sheets chilled the continent. This created a kind of geographic sweet spot, a zone where humans could thrive if they had the knowledge and skills to do so, and there's strong evidence that they did. Around 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age began to wind down, people started arriving in this region, or had already been living there for centuries, following game animals and establishing seasonal camps along the rivers and coastal areas. These were Paleo-Indians, the first Americans, the ancestors of every native culture that would come after them, and they were sophisticated hunters and gatherers who understood their environment with an intimacy that modern people can barely comprehend. They knew which plants were edible and which were poisonous, which animals were safe to hunt and which were dangerous, how to read the landscape to find water and shelter, and how to navigate across terrain using only the sun and stars and their intimate knowledge of the land. Archaeological evidence from sites along the modern coast of Florida and Texas tells us that these early peoples were skilled maritime hunters, capable of building boats and fishing in coastal waters, and some evidence suggests they may have hunted now extinct megafauna like mammoths and mastodons that still roam the continent. The continental shelf during this period was a complex landscape of environments, with wetland areas near the coastline that provided abundant food sources, fish and shellfish and waterfowl, and higher ground inland where forests grew and larger game animals lived. Rivers flowed across this landscape carrying fresh water and nutrients, creating zones of exceptional fertility where humans could establish more permanent settlements, places where they could stay for months at a time rather than constantly moving from camp to camp. Some of these settlements were probably quite large, housing perhaps hundreds of people, with structures built from wood and stone, storage facilities for food, and organized activity areas for different tasks like butchering meat or making tools. These communities likely engaged in trade with other settlements inland and along the coast, exchanging goods and resources and knowledge, creating networks of connection that bound them together in a shared culture and identity. The evidence for this comes from several sources, including scattered underwater archaeological surveys and data collected from core samples drilled into the ocean floor, which reveal stone tools and worked bone and other indicators of human presence on the continental shelf. One particularly fascinating site is the Aftonian, discovered off the coast of Louisiana, where underwater archaeology has revealed the presence of human-made structures and artifacts in places that are now submerged dozens of meters below the surface. Another site, the Bluefish Caves in Yukon, wasn't underwater but contains evidence of human occupation dating back nearly 20,000 years, suggesting that people had spread across North America earlier than previously believed and may have been well established in the Gulf region by the time the Ice Age was coming to an end. The technology available to these Paleo-Indians was sophisticated in its own right, even though it looks primitive to modern eyes, because they had learned to make complex tools from stone and bone that could accomplish almost any task necessary for survival and thriving in their environment. They made spear points designed to penetrate the hide of large animals, fishing hooks and harpoon heads designed to catch fish in the rivers and coastal waters, scrapers and blades for working with animal hides and plant fibers, and containers made from bone and wood for storing and transporting food and water. This toolkit had been refined and improved over thousands of years of continuous cultural development, passed down from generation to generation, with modifications and innovations, representing an accumulation of knowledge that would have taken many human lifetimes to develop. The societies that lived on this submerged landscape were probably organized into family groups and larger bands, with leaders who commanded respect through skill and knowledge rather than coercive force, sharing resources according to systems of reciprocal obligation and seasonal gatherings where people from different settlements came together for trade, marriage, and ritual. These gatherings would have been important for maintaining cultural identity and facilitating the exchange of goods over long distances, creating networks of relationship that stretched across the entire Gulf region and beyond. The spiritual beliefs of these people are harder for us to reconstruct, but based on the beliefs of later Native American cultures and the limited archaeological evidence available, we can infer that they probably had rich mythological traditions involving animals and natural forces, that they probably conducted rituals and ceremonies tied to the cycles of seasons and the movements of animals, and that they understood themselves as part of a larger cosmos that included both visible and invisible realms. Archaeological investigations at sites like the Monte Verde settlement in Chile have shown that early Americans had sophisticated understanding of medicinal plants and had developed complex hunting strategies adapted to their specific environments, suggesting that Gulf Coast populations would have possessed similar sophisticated knowledge systems. The discovery of shell tools and bone hooks at various coastal archaeological sites indicates specialized knowledge about maritime hunting and fish processing techniques. Studies of preserved plant remains suggest that early Gulf Coast inhabitants recognized and may have even encouraged the growth of useful plant species like sunflowers and wild rice. Around 10,000 years ago, the climate began to change dramatically, in ways that would fundamentally alter the geography of the Gulf region and the lives of everyone living there. Because as the planet warmed and the great ice sheets that covered North America began to melt, the sea level rose steadily year after year, century after century, a slow and inexorable flooding that must have seemed like the world was being swallowed by the ocean. The rate of this rise varied over time, sometimes climbing rapidly over decades and centuries, sometimes slowing down. But the overall trend was always upward, always toward inundation, always destroying the familiar landscape and forcing people to adapt or migrate to higher ground. For those living on the Gulf Coast, this must have been a catastrophe that unfolded across generations, watching the shoreline retreat inland, watching places where their ancestors were buried and their sacred sites were located gradually disappear beneath the waves, watching the loss of hunting grounds and gathering areas that had sustained them for millennia. Some settlements that had been established inland on higher ground would have remained habitable, but those on the coast and on the continental shelf would have been forced to abandon their homes and move northward or westward in search of stable ground that wouldn't be claimed by the rising waters. The rate of sea level rise during this period wasn't consistent everywhere, because different parts of the coast experienced different rates of flooding, depending on local geology and the dynamics of ice sheet melting in different regions. But overall, people living on the Gulf Coast would have experienced a gradual or sometimes rapid displacement from their traditional territories. Scientific evidence from ice cores and ocean sediment cores provides documentation of the warming that occurred during this period, showing temperature increases that altered ocean circulation patterns and accelerated ice sheet melting in North America and elsewhere around the globe. By roughly 8,500 years ago, the sea level had risen so much that it was approaching where it sits today, meaning that the coastal geography of the Gulf had been fundamentally transformed from an open, exposed landscape with vast settlements and thriving populations to something closer to what we see in modern times. The continental shelf that had been home to so many communities was now submerged beneath tens of meters of water, and the sites where people had lived for thousands of years were now accessible only by diving far below the surface or by drilling into the ocean floor and analysing the sediments for evidence of human presence. This flooding didn't happen suddenly, like a tsunami, but it was still catastrophic in its own way, because it represented the permanent loss of territory and resources and the sacred spaces of the ancestors, forcing communities to reorganise themselves around new economic strategies and new settlement patterns that could work with the new geography. Yet the mystery deepens here, because while we know that settlements must have existed on the submerged continental shelf, we have very limited archaeological data about what those settlements actually looked like, how large they were, what they contained, how many people lived in them, and how they were organised, because most of the evidence has been buried under sediment and sand and the passage of 10,000 years. This is where the real intrigue of the sunken city begins to take hold, because scholars and archaeologists have been piecing together clues about these lost settlements from scattered evidence, from underwater discoveries, from comparative studies of known archaeological sites, and from geological data about the landscape that existed before it was flooded. We know from the Doggerland example, an area between Britain and Europe that was similarly inundated by rising seas after the Ice Age, that such landscapes can support large populations and complex settlement patterns, with evidence suggesting that thousands of people may have lived in these areas before they were flooded. The Gulf Coast's submerged landscape likely hosted similar populations and similar complexity, settlements that were connected by trade networks and shared cultural traditions, places where people lived stable lives, built homes, raised families, created art, and developed the knowledge systems that allowed them to thrive in their specific environment. One of the most intriguing questions that archaeologists and oceanographers are starting to ask is whether these settlements might have reached a level of social complexity that we don't usually associate with hunter-gatherer societies, whether they might have had craft specialists who made goods for trade, whether they might have had leaders who commanded significant resources and prestige, whether they might have developed some form of agriculture or intensive resource management that allowed them to support larger populations than typical mobile hunter-gatherer societies. Some evidence suggests that people were beginning to experiment with cultivating plants and managing their environment in new ways during this period, that they might have been on a path toward the kind of sedentary agricultural societies that would later develop in different parts of North America. The Gulf region was rich in resources: fish, shellfish, waterfowl, deer, and other game animals, and in locations where these resources were abundant and predictable, people could afford to stay in one place year-round or for most of the year, accumulating goods and developing more complex social structures than peoples who had to move frequently to find food. This raises the possibility that the submerged cities of the Gulf weren't primitive scattered camps but settlements with genuine urban characteristics, with neighbourhoods organised by function, with storage facilities for food, with craft production areas, with public spaces for gathering and ceremony, with residential areas that showed some level of planning and organisation. We don't know how large these settlements were or how many people they contained, but if they were anything like Azette in the Pacific Northwest, where a mudslide preserved a village that housed several hundred people before it was buried, or like the more recent settlements that would develop in the Mississippian culture much later, they could have been substantial communities with populations in the hundreds, or perhaps even thousands. The evidence we do have comes from several sources, including surveys conducted by oil companies and research institutions that have found scattered artifacts on the continental shelf, including stone tools and bone implements that show evidence of human modification and appear to date to the period before the sea level rose. Underwater archaeologists have also found what appear to be shell middens from the Ice Age, the accumulated refuse of human meals, preserved in sediment layers that correspond to the period when the continental shelf was exposed and habitable. These discoveries are fragmentary and tantalizing, like pieces of a puzzle where most of the pieces are missing, but they confirm what we would expect from theory and from the evidence of contemporary sites along the modern coast, that people were living on the continental shelf and making use of its resources, Specialized equipment like remotely operated vehicles and advanced sonar systems has allowed researchers to map sections of the continental shelf with unprecedented detail, revealing anomalies that might indicate human structures or activity zones. Researchers have documented tool clusters and bone scatters in patterns suggesting organized activity areas dedicated to specific tasks. Chemical analysis of sediment layers has identified evidence of fire pits and cooking areas, suggesting places where communities gathered to prepare and consume food together. As we contemplate these submerged ruins and try to imagine the lives of the people who built them, we're forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about history and about the way we think about the past. Because these settlements don't appear in our textbooks, they're not included in our standard narratives of human progress, and they remain largely unknown even to people who consider themselves well-educated about American history. This is partly because they're literally inaccessible, buried deep beneath the ocean, but it's also because the peoples who built them didn't leave behind written records or monumental architecture or the other kinds of evidence that archaeologists traditionally use to reconstruct the past. Yet the absence of written records shouldn't lead us to dismiss these settlements as unimportant or simple, because some of the greatest human civilizations developed without writing, and the sophistication of a society shouldn't be measured by the permanence of its buildings or the durability of its monuments, but by the complexity of its knowledge systems and the ingenuity of its solutions to the problems of living in a particular environment. So what really happened to these sunken cities, and why have they been lost to history for so long, waiting beneath the water like secrets the earth has been keeping, like memories that the ocean itself has swallowed and hidden from the light of modern understanding? The short answer is that they were flooded by rising sea levels, but the longer answer is far more complex and profound, involving questions about adaptation and migration and cultural continuity, about how human communities respond to environmental change, about what it means to lose a homeland and have to start over somewhere new. As the continental shelf flooded, the people living there would have been forced to make increasingly difficult choices: stay and adapt to a shrinking territory, migrate inland to compete with existing populations, spread along the coast to follow the retreating shoreline, or attempt to maintain maritime settlements that could make use of the new ocean in different ways. Some communities probably split apart, with different groups choosing different strategies, some staying and developing new ways of life based on maritime resources, others moving inland or along the coast, carrying with them the cultural traditions and knowledge systems they had developed over millennia of habitation in the Gulf region. The population pressure created by this displacement would have ripple effects across the entire continent, as people moved into new territories and either integrated with existing communities or competed with them for resources, spreading new ideas and technologies and cultural practices, reshaping the demographic and cultural landscape of North America. This period, the transition from the Ice Age to the modern climate, and from the exposed continental shelf to the flooded Gulf we know today, represents one of the greatest turning points in human history in North America, a period of environmental catastrophe and cultural transformation that fundamentally reset the conditions under which human societies operated. The sunken cities of the Gulf of Mexico are the monuments to this moment, preserved in the sediments of the ocean floor, waiting for future archaeologists with better technology to find them and bring their stories back to light, to recover the knowledge and insights of the people who built them and lived in them before the waters rose and claimed them for the ocean. Understanding these underwater sites requires new methodologies that blend marine archaeology, geological analysis, and traditional archaeological techniques. Research teams use specialized equipment to conduct surveys without disturbing the fragile sediment layers. Collaborative efforts between university researchers and offshore industry partners have generated new data about the submerged landscape. Funding challenges remain significant, as studying areas far offshore requires expensive equipment and extended research expeditions. What we're learning from these remote and difficult investigations is that the submerged continental shelf wasn't empty land waiting for discovery, but a fully inhabited world with its own history and complexity and meaning to the people who lived there. The artifacts we find, scattered stone tools, bone fragments, occasional worked pieces of shell and antler, represent only the tiniest fraction of the material culture that must have existed there, the merest hints of the material world that supported thousands of human lives across thousands of years. Bone degrades quickly in most archaeological contexts, So the organic materials that dominated the daily lives of these coastal peoples, baskets made from plant fibers, wooden structures and vessels, clothing made from animal hide, are largely lost to us, preserved only rarely in exceptional conditions where sediment sealed them from decay. The stone tools that do survive give us windows into what people valued and what activities they performed, but they can only tell us part of the story of what daily life was actually like in these communities. The division of labour in these societies likely varied by season and by the specific location of each settlement, with some people specialising in hunting certain types of game, others focusing on fishing or shell gathering, others manufacturing tools or processing food for storage, and still others performing spiritual or leadership functions that held the community together and gave it meaning and direction. The role of women in these societies was probably substantial and important, as ethnographic evidence from more recent hunter-gatherer societies suggests that women typically gathered more calories through plant gathering than men did through hunting, even when hunting was culturally valued more highly. The wetland environments that covered much of the exposed continental shelf offered exceptional diversity in plant foods, including root vegetables and wild tubers that could be harvested in large quantities and dried for winter storage, nuts from various tree species that provided essential fats and proteins, and leafy greens and other seasonal plants that contributed important nutrients to the diet. Women would have spent significant portions of the year in plant gathering activities, developing deep knowledge of the seasonal calendar and the specific locations where each type of plant grew, passing this knowledge down to daughters and other female relatives through patient instruction and participation. The knowledge systems that women maintained, knowing where edible plants grew, when they fruited or flowered, how to process them for maximum nutrition and storage value, would have been absolutely critical to community survival, particularly as the climate changed and traditional resources became less reliable or shifted to new locations. Children in these communities would have learned through observation and direct participation in daily activities, slowly accumulating the vast repertoire of practical knowledge and cultural traditions that their society maintained and required for survival. Stories and songs would have served as repositories for crucial information about the environment and the proper ways of living, transmitting knowledge across generations in forms that were memorable and engaging for young people. The concept of a formal education as we know it wouldn't have existed, but the cultural transmission of essential knowledge would have been just as thorough and systematic as formal schooling, accomplished through narrative and participation rather than through explicit teaching. Social roles and relationships would have been deeply embedded in kinship structures and marriage alliances, with individuals defined partly by their family connections and the obligations and privileges that came with those connections. The accumulation of knowledge about plants and animals and weather patterns and seasonal movements would have been understood as belonging to specific families or kinship groups, transmitted from elders to younger people as they matured and assumed adult roles and responsibilities. This kind of knowledge was often protected and kept within families, with specific hunting or gathering territories being recognized as belonging to particular lineages or bands, and access to productive locations being controlled through complex systems of inheritance and reciprocal obligation. Such systems would have promoted efficient resource management and prevented overexploitation of particular areas, allowing populations to sustain themselves in one location for generations at a time, something that mobile hunter-gatherer societies often cannot do. Before we move deeper into the mystery, before we explore what these settlements might have looked like, and what evidence we have for their existence, and what happened to the people who lived there, we need to understand the landscape more deeply, to visualize in our minds what the Gulf of Mexico actually looked like when it was dry, to see the rivers and forests and grasslands and beaches that existed before the water reclaimed them all. In the next part of this story, we'll examine the geography of the submerged landscape in detail, looking at what the submerged coastline probably looked like, where the major settlements might have been located, what natural resources were available, and how the people living there probably organized themselves to take advantage of those resources. Because understanding the landscape is the key to understanding the people, and understanding the people is the key to understanding what was really lost when the waters rose and the ancient world was swallowed by the sea. So who exactly were these people living on the edge of the ancient Gulf Coast? Well, to understand them, we need to step back and imagine the world they inhabited, because it was fundamentally different from anything we know today. These weren't the sophisticated civilizations we often think of when we talk about history. These were the Paleo-Indians, the first people to arrive in North America after the last ice age ended, around 18,000 years ago, and they were incredibly resilient, incredibly skilled survivors. The ones we're focusing on lived along what we now call the Gulf Coast, in that remarkable exposed shelf that stretched far out into what is now the Gulf of Mexico, and they thrived there for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence suggests that by around 12,000 years ago, these coastal communities had developed incredibly sophisticated knowledge of their environment, knowledge that allowed them to live in relative abundance in a landscape that was constantly changing as the climate warmed and the seas rose. When we look at the artifacts left behind, when we examine the shell middens and the tool assemblages and the faint traces of their camps, we're looking at people who are far more complex than the popular imagination sometimes suggests. They weren't primitive at all. They were observant, innovative, and deeply adapted to their particular world. The people who lived on the exposed Gulf Shelf, the area that was dry land during the last ice age and the millennia following it, were hunter-gatherers in the truest sense. But that term, hunter-gatherer, can be misleading because it suggests a kind of desperate scrambling for food, a life of constant scarcity and struggle. The reality was quite different. The environment they inhabited was one of extraordinary abundance. Imagine walking out from what is now the Texas coast, or the coast of Louisiana, walking east across a landscape that stretched for dozens of miles beyond where the water is today. What you would encounter first would be grasslands and open woodlands, areas that supported enormous herds of megafauna. Mastodons, those massive hairy relatives of elephants, roamed these plains. Giant ground sloths, some as tall as a giraffe, moved slowly through the landscape, browsing on vegetation. Camels and horses, yes, horses lived in North America in those days, grazed alongside them. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and giant bears hunted these herds. It was a lost world, a world that no longer exists, and the Paleo-Indians who lived there had learned to navigate it with remarkable skill. But these people weren't just hunters of the great beasts on the plains. That's an important point to emphasize because the archaeological record shows us something more complex. The sites we find along the ancient Gulf Coast tell us that these people were deeply specialized in coastal and marine resources. There was a site called Page Ladson, discovered in Florida, that shows us evidence of human activity dating back 12,000 years, and what's fascinating about that site is the mix of evidence it contains. We find tools for hunting, yes, but we also find evidence of fishing and shellfish collection. We find charred nutshells from hickory trees. We find evidence of plant processing and gathering. The diet of these coastal people was diverse and seasonally adjusted. They understood that different resources came available at different times of year, and they organized their lives around these seasonal cycles. In the spring and early summer, as the lagoons and shallow bays warmed up, fish would run inland, and the people would move to intercept them at favorable locations. In the fall, they would harvest nuts from the forest that covered the interior of the exposed shelf. Throughout the year, shellfish were always available, a reliable protein source that required minimal technology to harvest. Speaking of shellfish, we need to talk about the shell middens because they're some of our most important evidence for understanding how these people lived. A midden is basically an ancient garbage heap, a place where people discarded the shells from the shellfish they ate, along with bones from animals they hunted and other debris from daily life. When archaeologists excavate these middens, they're essentially reading the recipe of ancient diets, understanding what people ate and when they ate it. Along the ancient Gulf Coast, we find enormous shell middens, some of them containing millions of shells, accumulated over centuries or even millennia. These aren't random accumulations either. The shells are often sorted, with oyster shells in some layers and other species in different layers, suggesting deliberate deposition and management of the waste. The scale of these middens tells us something important about population density and the abundance of resources. You don't get massive shell middens unless a considerable number of people are living in an area and harvesting shellfish intensively for extended periods. The presence of these features indicates that the coastal zone supported substantial, possibly semi-permanent settlements. Now, let's talk about the hunting of the megafauna, because that's something that captures our imagination and has also been the subject of considerable archaeological debate. The question of how Paleo-Indians hunted these enormous animals is something that's fascinated researchers for decades. The tools they used were sophisticated. Clovis points, Those distinctive flaked stone projectile points named after a site in New Mexico are found throughout the continent, and yes, some of them have been found in offshore context, brought up from the sea floor, evidence of human activity on that now submerged shelf. These points are incredibly sharp, capable of penetrating thick hide and delivering a killing blow. But hunting a mastodon or a giant ground sloth wasn't just about having a sharp point. It required knowledge, planning, and often cooperation among multiple hunters. The animals were massive, weighing up to 10 tons in some cases. A single hunter with a spear, no matter how well made, wasn't going to bring one down alone. Archaeological evidence from kill sites found in North America suggests that hunters would coordinate their efforts, driving animals into natural traps, into boggy areas where they would become mired and easier to kill, or using sophisticated knowledge of animal behavior to position themselves for ambush. Some researchers believe that the rapid extinction of many megafauna species might have been hastened by human hunting pressure, though this remains debated among scientists as climate change at the end of the Ice Age also played a significant role. The tools that these people made are themselves a testament to their ingenuity and skill. Beyond the famous Clovis points used for hunting large game, they created a diverse toolkit for different purposes. There were scrapers made from flakes of stone, used for processing hides and bone. There were blades with sharp edges for cutting and filleting. There were hammerstones and anvils for breaking open shells and bones. There were bone and antler tools, harpoon heads for fishing, fish hooks, needles for making clothing. Some of these items required remarkable precision to manufacture. A bone needle, for instance, needs to be the right diameter, smoothly polished, and have a precisely drilled hole at one end. Creating such an object from a piece of raw bone requires not just tools but patience and skill, and a clear understanding of the material you're working with. The fact that we find these items, sometimes in considerable numbers, tells us that these were people who had perfected their craft over generations, who had accumulated knowledge about how to turn raw materials into useful objects. They weren't making these tools haphazardly. There was technique involved, methodology, skill that was passed down from elder to younger person, from parent to child. The organisation of these ancient communities is something we can infer from the archaeological evidence, though of course we're always working with incomplete information. The seasonal camps we find scattered across the ancient Gulf shelf seem to represent a semi-nomadic lifestyle. Groups would establish seasonal settlements at locations that offered rich resources, stay for a period of weeks or months, harvest what was available, and then move on to the next camp. The summer camps tended to be located near lagoons and shallow bays where fishing was productive. The fall camps were positioned near groves of nut-bearing trees. The winter camps, from what we can tell, might have been situated in more sheltered locations inland from the coast. This seasonal migration pattern, known as transhumance, allowed these groups to take advantage of resources that were scattered across the landscape, but were abundant when you knew where to look and when to look. It's a strategy that many hunter-gatherer societies have used throughout history and prehistory, and it's an incredibly efficient way to live if you have good knowledge of your environment and the ability to move your settlement periodically. But these people weren't constantly on the move. Within these seasonal camps, there's evidence of substantial structures and organisation. Post moulds, the traces left in the ground where wooden posts used to stand, suggest that people built shelters, probably some kind of framework structure covered with hides or plant materials. Some sites show evidence of fire pits with careful construction, suggesting that people took time to properly organise their living spaces even in temporary camps. The presence of hearths with charred remains of meals tells us about cooking techniques. They roasted shellfish in their shells, heating them until the meat could be extracted easily. They grilled fish over fires, and the charred fish bones we find are evidence of this. They boiled food in hide-lined pits or stone-lined hearths, using hot stones to bring water to a boil, then cooking whatever was available. The diversity of cooking techniques suggests a deep knowledge of food preparation, an understanding that different foods require different handling and cooking times to be most palatable and nutritious. The social organisation of these groups is something we can only infer, but the evidence suggests complexity. Shell middens of different sizes might represent camps of different sizes, possibly seasonal variation, or perhaps different social groups. The presence of prestige items, objects that seem to have been valued beyond their practical utility, suggests status differentiation within groups. There's evidence of long-distance trade goods at some sites, materials that could not have come from the immediate area but must have been obtained through exchange networks extending across considerable distances. This suggests that these groups weren't isolated. They were part of larger networks, trading partners with other communities, engaged in exchange relationships that brought both practical goods and exotic items that probably carried social meaning. The movement of trade goods, the presence of shells from the Atlantic coast found at sites on the Gulf Coast and vice versa, tells us that information and goods were flowing along the coastline, that there were established trading relationships and probably also established routes for commerce. Let's talk more specifically about the environment that these people inhabited because it shaped everything about their way of life. The coastline itself was different from what we see today. Because sea levels were lower, the configuration of land and water was fundamentally altered. What is now the continental shelf, underwater and invisible, was dry land. The rivers that now flow into the Gulf of Mexico had different courses. The Mississippi River, for instance, would have extended much further out into the Gulf, creating a massive delta where there is now only open water. Fresh water from these rivers would have created extensive lagoons and estuaries, where the Gulf shelf met the coast proper. These freshwater and brackish water environments would have been incredibly productive, supporting abundant fish populations, waterfowl, and other resources. The vegetation on the shelf would have been a mosaic of different habitat types. Near the coasts and lagoons, there would have been wetlands, marshes where cattails and other wetland plants grew, areas rich with waterfowl and fish. Moving inland from these wetlands, there would have been coastal forests, trees adapted to sandy soils, cypress and live oak and other species that form forest today in coastal regions. Further inland, the forest would have given way to grasslands and more open woodlands, the habitat of the megafauna that roamed this landscape. The climate, it's worth noting, was changing throughout the period we're discussing. When people first arrived in North America, around 18,000 years ago, the world was still in the grip of the last ice age. The great ice sheets covered much of what is now Canada, and the climate was cooler and drier than today. Sea levels were far lower. The Gulf shelf was exposed and probably still quite bare of vegetation, recently freed from glacial ice or permafrost. But as the millennia passed, the climate warmed. The ice sheets melted, releasing enormous quantities of water into the oceans. Sea levels began to rise, slowly at first, then more rapidly. Around 8,000 years ago, the rate of sea level rise accelerated, and the ancient Gulf shore began to drown. Landscapes that had supported human settlement for thousands of years were gradually covered by water. The people living there would have watched this happen, would have had to adjust their lives to the changing geography. Some groups probably moved inland as the water rose. Others might have adjusted to exploiting the new marine resources that became available as the lagoons and bays expanded. There's evidence that coastal settlement continued even as the sea level rose, with communities adapting to the changing conditions and continuing to extract a living from the marine environment. This brings us to an important point about the relationship between these people and their environment. These were not passive inhabitants of the landscape. They didn't simply accept the world as they found it. There's growing evidence that Paleo-Indians and their descendants actively managed their environment to increase productivity. One way they did this was through the use of fire. Controlled burning of grasslands and forests can eliminate woody growth, encourage the growth of new vegetation that attracts megafauna, reduce the threat of catastrophic wildfires, and promote the growth of plants useful to humans. There's evidence that fire was used in this way in many regions of North America, and there's no reason to think the Gulf Coast dwellers weren't doing something similar. Another form of environmental management came through selective harvesting and harvesting practices that encouraged reproduction of useful species. If you eat the shellfish from your local lagoon but leave enough adults to reproduce, the population will continue to be productive. If you understand that nut trees are more productive in open settings with less competition, you might work to maintain that open setting. These are subtle forms of land management, but they're real, and they show that these people weren't just taking from their environment passively, but were actively engaged in maintaining and improving it. The relationship between groups would have been complex. In an environment of relative abundance, with enough resources for substantial populations, there was probably reduced pressure for intergroup conflict over resources. But this doesn't mean these groups lived in peaceful isolation from each other. The trade goods and exchange networks we see in the archaeological records suggest regular contact. Some of this contact was probably friendly, based on mutual benefit. But human nature being what it is, there was probably also competition. probably also conflict. The absence of massive defensive structures or evidence of widespread violence doesn't mean conflict was absent, just that it probably looked different from the organised warfare we associate with later societies. Raids, small-scale conflicts, disputes over territory or resources, these probably all occurred, but they probably didn't dominate the archaeological record the way they do for societies with more developed hierarchical organisation. The spiritual life and beliefs of these people are almost entirely lost to us. We can sometimes infer aspects of spiritual practice from the archaeological record. Burial practices tell us something about what people believed happened after death. Grave goods, objects buried with the dead, suggest beliefs about an afterlife or the need of the dead for material goods. Some sites show evidence of elaborate burials, suggesting important individuals who were honoured with special treatment. But these fragmentary clues give us only hints of the full spiritual landscape these people inhabited. We don't know what gods or spirits they believed in, what stories they told about the creation of the world, what rituals marked important transitions in their lives. This is the silent part of prehistory, the aspect that leaves the fewest traces and is therefore the most difficult to reconstruct. Yet this spiritual dimension was probably as important to these people as the material aspects of their lives, and the loss of this knowledge is something we should acknowledge when we're talking about the past. But let's get back to the physical aspects of how these people lived, because that's where our evidence is strongest. The tools they made, the food they ate, the camps they occupied, these leave traces. Let me tell you more specifically about what a day in the life of one of these coastal people might have been like, keeping in mind that I'm speculating based on the evidence, but speculating in a way that's grounded in what we actually know. Picture an adult member of a coastal band, someone who knows the lagoon and its resources intimately. They wake at dawn in their shelter, probably made of wooden poles covered with hides or plant material. The fire that kept the camp warm through the night is being tended by someone, probably someone assigned to that task. Breakfast might consist of leftover roasted fish from yesterday's catch, some nuts cracked open during the previous evening's work, maybe some gathered plants, roots or seeds or berries if they're in season. After eating, the person might walk down to the lagoon to check the fishing traps or nets set the day before. Woven from plant fibres or twisted from sinew, these traps and nets are sophisticated technology, products of generations of refinement in how to most efficiently catch fish. If the catch was good, the person might spend the morning filleting and processing the fish, drying some of it over a slow fire for preservation, cooking some of it fresh for the camp. If the catch was poor, they might decide to try a different location or try hunting instead. If hunting was the plan for the day, the person would prepare, making sure their weapons were in good condition, checking the binding on their spear points, selecting the best materials for their tools. They might gather others from the camp and they'd head inland, moving through the grasslands and open woodlands watching for signs of game. The actual hunt, when it came, would be intense, requiring focus and physical effort and an intimate knowledge of animal behaviour. A successful hunt might mean a mammal as large as a mastodon, or as small as a deer, depending on what was encountered. A successful hunt was cause for celebration in the camp. The meat would be divided according to whatever social rules governed the distribution of meat, probably with more meat going to the hunters who made the kill, but with shares going to others in the group as well. This system of sharing was probably crucial for social cohesion and for ensuring that unsuccessful hunters and their families didn't go without. The hides would be valuable, used for clothing and shelter coverings. The bones would be processed, some for tools, some for ornaments, some perhaps for weapons or ritual objects. Women in these societies, and we can infer this from modern hunter-gatherer societies that share similar environmental constraints, probably spent a substantial portion of their time on gathering, plant collection, and processing. This might actually have provided a more reliable and substantial portion of the diet than hunting did. The collection of shellfish from the lagoons was probably a task that fell to women and children, and it's something that could be done more safely and with less risk than hunting large game. Gathering nuts, seeds, and other plant foods would have been a female-centered activity in many societies, but these divisions weren't absolute. There's evidence from ethnographic records of hunter-gatherer societies that women sometimes hunted and men sometimes gathered, and the divisions were probably more flexible than we sometimes imagine. Children would have learned the skills of adults through observation and participation, gradually taking on more responsibility as they aged. Elderly people, even when they could no longer engage in strenuous hunting or gathering, would have had value as repositories of knowledge, teaching younger people about the seasonal patterns of resources, the history and mythology of the group, the techniques for making tools and processing food. The making of tools was a craft that required skill and knowledge, and based on the evidence, it seems to have been taken seriously. At some sites, we find concentrations of stone tools and waste flakes, suggesting that toolmaking happened in dedicated locations, perhaps where a particularly skilled individual worked, or where apprentices learned the craft. The process of making a stone tool is far more complex than it might initially seem. You can't just bash rocks together and expect to get useful tools. You need to understand the properties of different stones, to know which stones are suitable for toolmaking and which aren't, to understand how stone fractures and how to control that fracturing to produce the desired shape. Making a Clovis point, for instance, involves dozens of careful flake removals, each one calculated to bring the tool closer to the final desired form. Mistakes in the process can ruin the blank you're working on, wasting time and materials. The fact that we find examples of this work at specific sites suggests that toolmaking wasn't necessarily something everyone did, but something that specialized individuals might have focused on, trading or giving their tools to others in exchange for other goods or services. One aspect of life that we can only guess at, but which was probably important, is the role of trade and exchange. We've mentioned that goods travelled long distances, but what was the mechanism for this? Were there trading expeditions where groups travelled to visit other groups? Were there neutral trading zones where groups met to exchange goods? Or were goods passed hand to hand through a chain of intermediate traders? The materials we find in the archaeological record give us clues. Shells from the Atlantic coast hundreds of miles away appear at Gulf Coast sites. Certain types of high-quality stone suitable for toolmaking found only in specific regions appear at sites far from their origin. This movement of goods speaks to contact and communication, but the extent and nature of that contact remains mysterious. What we can say is that these ancient people were not isolated. They were connected to broader networks of exchange and communication, and those networks probably facilitated the spread of ideas and innovations as well as goods. A new hunting technique developed in one area might spread to neighbouring areas through these networks. A story or myth might travel along trade routes. A language might change and split as groups moved and contact was reduced. These processes of cultural change were probably constant in the past, just as they are today. Now, I want to emphasize something important about the life of these coastal Paleo-Indians that often gets lost in discussions of ancient peoples. These were not desperate people living on the edge of starvation. They were not struggling to survive in a harsh and unforgiving environment. The evidence suggests the opposite. The richness of their shell middens, the seasonal camps that could accommodate considerable populations, the evidence of technological sophistication and craft specialization, all of this points to people living in relative abundance. People whose basic needs were probably met with relatively modest effort compared to the effort required by agriculturalists who followed them. This is an important point because it challenges a narrative that sees human history as a progression from worse to better, from primitive and harsh to civilized and comfortable. In some ways, the shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture, which would happen in some regions after the flooding of the Gulf Coast forced change, actually represented a decline in living standards for people, at least initially. Agriculture required more work per calorie produced than hunting and gathering, resulted in worse nutrition, and supported less leisure time. The abundance enjoyed by these coastal peoples was probably lost once their territory was submerged and they were forced to adapt to new conditions. As we approach the end of this section on the people who lived on the ancient Gulf Coast, I want to emphasize the tragedy that came with the rising seas. For thousands of years, these peoples had developed an intimate knowledge of their landscape and resources. They had created a way of life that worked, that provided for their needs and allowed for community, culture, and leisure. They had probably developed complex mythologies, understood their environment in sophisticated ways, created art and music and stories. They probably understood the rising seas in its early stages, might have even believed in the ability to appease the waters or wait them out. But the flooding was relentless. Year after year, the water rose. The camps had to be moved higher. The familiar hunting and gathering territories became inaccessible. Entire regions that had been continuously occupied for millennia became underwater, lost forever. Some groups probably retreated inland, abandoning the coast entirely and moving to new territories. Others probably tried to cling to the coast, moving their settlements higher as the water rose, gradually being pushed further and further back. Some of these displaced peoples, their ancestral lands drowned beneath the rising seas, probably became refugees, arriving in other territories where established groups already lived, creating the kind of social tension and competition that emerges when new populations move into spaces that are already claimed. Yet despite this catastrophe, despite the loss of their homeland, these people survived. They adapted, they changed their ways, their descendants continued on, in the lands they moved to, carrying with them the cultural legacy of their ancestors, the knowledge and stories and innovations developed during thousands of years living on the coast. The drowned cities and camps now rest on the sea floor, entombed in sediment, a ghost landscape that we can barely perceive today, but that was as real and as lived in as any city or town is now. And in some sense, by examining the artifacts and features left behind, by understanding the ways these people lived, we're bringing those ghost landscapes back to life, preserving something of the memory of the people who walked that ancient shore. Next, we'll explore what happened when the waters rose, when this world was lost, and how these ancient peoples had to dramatically remake their way of life. So here's where our story takes a turn towards something more primal, more desperate. We've met these people fishing and trading across networks. They built a culture that stretched from the Yucatan Peninsula up toward what is now Louisiana and Texas. But everything they knew, everything they built, everything they believed would last forever was about to wash away. The culprit wasn't war or disease or famine, though those things certainly happened too. No, the real killer was the ocean itself, moving in with a slow relentlessness that must have felt like watching the world drown. This is the story of the end of an ancient era, the story of the Great Melt when the Ice Age released its final grip and waters rose. Around 14,500 years ago, something began to happen in the far north that nobody living on the Gulf Shelf could have predicted. The massive Laurentide ice sheet that covered most of North America was collapsing in ways that would reshape the entire planet fundamentally. For thousands of years it had been thinning, retreating, cracking apart gradually under the warming climate. But around this critical time, something changed fundamentally and irreversibly. The pace accelerated dramatically in ways that stunned the climate system itself and altered ocean circulation patterns. Meltwater, liquid water released from those collapsing ice sheets, began flooding into the oceans at unprecedented rates that had never been seen before. The ice sheets weren't melting at the edges alone. They were fragmenting internally, collapsing from within as water percolated down to their bases. Massive channels opened within the ice, allowing vast quantities of meltwater to pour toward the sea in catastrophic pulses. We're talking about the biggest pulse of fresh water entering the world's seas in the entire post-Ice Age era. Scientists call this Meltwater Pulse 1A, and it's one of the most significant geological events in human history. Most of the people who lived through it had no idea what was happening far away in the north where the climate was spiraling into chaos. The water didn't come all at once like a tsunami crashing ashore suddenly and without warning. Instead, it came in a series of surges over maybe a century or two, which sounds like a long time until you think carefully about multiple generations. A rise of 6 feet per generation means the world changes fundamentally within a single human lifetime. Think about that for a moment very carefully. Your great-grandfather built his village on the beach. Your grandfather watched the waterline creep inland. Your father kept moving back to higher ground, and you had to do the same in your own lifetime. This was the reality these people faced. The mathematics of it are almost impossible to fathom in our modern context when we're used to stability. Every year the waterline moved further in. Every decade the horizon changed. Every generation lived a different relationship with the sea than their parents. The Gulf Shelf, where these old people lived, wasn't like a beach today with its sandy shorelines. It was vast, stretching out maybe 100 miles or more from the modern shoreline in some places. It was a landscape of lagoons and river valleys and marshlands that supported incredible biodiversity and abundance of life in every direction. Fish of all sizes, mammals that hunted in the waters, plants that grew in the brackish zones, and birds that fed on the abundance all thrived together. This was a shallow water paradise unlike anything we see today, teeming with life. When the meltwater pulses began, that landscape started to drown beneath rising water gradually and inexorably. The water didn't just appear overnight and submerge everything in one catastrophic event that happened at once. Instead, It crept in from the edges slowly, relentlessly, year after year, decade after decade, advancing inland like a living thing. Some areas might have experienced saltwater intrusion that ruined freshwater sources and made the land infertile for agriculture or drinking water gradually. The aquifers that had provided fresh water for generations became brackish and unsuitable. Other areas might have seen periodic inundation that destroyed crops and habitats repeatedly and unpredictably, making places that had been stable for centuries suddenly unpredictable and dangerous. The people living there couldn't rely on seasonal patterns anymore because the floods came at unexpected times. Entire river valleys that had been highways of commerce and communication were being drowned beneath rising water columns relentlessly. The Sabine River, the Trinity River, the Brazos River all would have seen their valleys transform dramatically. They went from lush lowlands into shallow seas, and marshes gradually changing the entire landscape forever. What had been good hunting ground became swamp. What had been grazing land became mudflat. Communities that had existed for hundreds of years faced an impossible choice: move inland or adapt to new water-filled landscapes. Some groups probably did both, splitting off to establish new settlements higher up the river valleys. They moved inland toward the piney woods and prairies that are there today in modern maps. But think about what that means in human terms and emotional terms very carefully. You're not just moving your home to a new location somewhere nearby. You're leaving behind the burial grounds of your ancestors stretching back generations and generations deep in the past. You're abandoning the sacred sites where you performed ceremonies for generations and generations of your people. You're saying goodbye to the richest hunting and fishing grounds your people have ever known in all their long history. The knowledge your grandmother taught you becomes irrelevant or dangerous. Where to find specific plants, where the fish congregate, the spiritual significance of particular landmarks, all of that vanishes. The landscape itself is transforming beneath your feet in ways you can't control or predict anymore. The river valley where your people were born becomes a bay. The hunting ground becomes a marsh. The place where you buried your mother becomes a tidal flat where the seabirds gather. Around 13,300 years ago, about 1,200 years after Meltwater Pulse 1A occurred, something similar happened again to the ice sheets. We call this Meltwater Pulse 1B, and while it was smaller than the first pulse, it was still dramatic and significant for the people living through it. Another surge of meltwater came from collapsing ice sheets. Another period of accelerated sea level rise affected millions directly. Another round of displacement came for coastal communities. The waters kept rising year after year without stopping for long or providing relief. By the end of these two major pulses, the sea level had gone up roughly 60 meters altogether. That's about 200 feet of vertical rise spreading across the continental shelf relentlessly. Most of that dramatic rise had happened over just a few centuries of the most intense flooding periods. People who were alive for 50 years would see the sea advance a quarter mile or more inland. To put it in perspective, that's enough to take land that was perfectly suitable for settlement and make it underwater permanently. It's enough to completely reorganize the geography of an entire region the size of a modern state. The shelf that the old Clovis culture and the pre-Clovis peoples had hunted and lived on was becoming increasingly marginal and difficult to use productively. The freshwater aquifers that had been accessible for drinking and watering crops were being contaminated with salt water from the encroaching sea gradually and irreversibly. The wells that had served communities became brackish. The salt marshes expanded where there had once been grasslands and pine forests thriving in the sunshine. Plants that needed fresh water died. Animals that needed grassland moved away or perished. The fish that people relied on were migrating to deeper waters as the shallow areas they'd inhabited disappeared beneath rising waters. We don't have detailed archaeological records of how different groups responded to these changes and adaptations. Most of the evidence is now underwater, buried beneath sediment and silt accumulated over millennia. We can piece together some of the story from what we find on higher ground further inland in the interior regions. The cultural record shows increasing complexity in sites that are inland from the old coastline, at places like Watson Break in Louisiana, where archaeological evidence abounds. People built massive earthen mounds around the same time that the coast was disappearing beneath waves. These mounds represent labour, organisation, planning, and ritual practices. Whether complexity came from inland migration or independent development, we can't say for certain, but the timeline is suggestive of massive cultural movements and refugee populations. The rising waters may have pushed people inland where they established new communities and reorganized themselves. The Great Melt wasn't uniform across the Gulf of Mexico and the entire coastline of the region. Some areas saw faster inundation than others, depending on local geology and the patterns of water flow. The Texas coast probably experienced somewhat different flooding than the Louisiana coast or the Yucatan Peninsula across the sea. Some areas had higher ground nearby where people could retreat. Other areas were flat for 100 miles or more, meaning there was nowhere to hide from the rising waters. In some places, the water rose so gradually that people might not have noticed dramatic changes year to year or even decade to decade from their immediate perspective. The change was slower in those locations, perhaps allowing for more gradual adaptation, but the total effect was still catastrophic by the human scale. But if you lived to be 60 or 70 years old, you would have seen your childhood home permanently below water level and inaccessible. You would have watched the landscape you knew as a child transformed into something completely unrecognizable and alien to you. The psychological impact of that kind of change must have been enormous and deep for entire societies. Not just the practical challenge of finding new lands to settle repeatedly with your community, but the spiritual and cultural dislocation of losing your homeland completely. Your entire worldview was shaped by certain places, certain spirits, certain sacred sites. All of that sank beneath the waves. The mythology of your people was written into the landscape, and that landscape was being erased. Every civilization around the world has stories about old floods, about waters rising and drowning the world in times long past. You find these myths in Mesopotamia, in India, in the Pacific Islands, in Mesoamerica across continents and cultures. Scholars have long debated whether these stories have a historical basis in actual events. They wondered if they're purely mythological or symbolic in nature. What happened around the Gulf of Mexico during the Ice Age's end becomes clear. These flood myths probably preserve historical memory, not necessarily the exact details and specifics of what occurred, but the core truth about waters rising. They came, they kept coming, and they changed the world forever in fundamental ways. This might explain why so many different cultures, separated by oceans and mountains, share similar flood narratives. They may be remembering the same terrible event, the time when the world changed. For the people living on the Gulf Shelf 10 or 12,000 years ago, the rising sea wasn't the apocalypse happening all at once. It was more like living in a slow-motion disaster, where you had to keep adapting constantly. You had to keep moving, keep adjusting your life to accommodate a changing world that wouldn't stay still. Some communities probably split apart, with different groups heading in different directions. Some probably sent out scouts to find new territory ahead of time, and then migrated there in an organized way. Others might have held on to their old homeland as long as possible. They were hoping the waters would stop rising somehow, gradually being pushed back to the last defensible positions before eventually being forced to abandon everything. There must have been resistance to leaving, spiritual ceremonies to ask the waters to stop, stories told around fires about how this would surely reverse soon. The archaeological record suggests that by around 8,500 years ago, the major phases of the Great Melt were finally complete. The sea level had mostly stabilized at something close to what we see today in modern times, but the damage, if you want to call it that, was done completely and permanently. The landscape had been completely remade in every way imaginable. The shallow shelf that had been the heart of ancient Gulf civilization was now deep ocean far underwater. The river valleys that had been trade corridors were now flooded estuaries and deltas filled with salt water. The vast coastal plains where people had hunted megafauna and built their communities were now underwater. They were covered in sediment and silt, and the slow accumulation of 10,000 years of ocean life and shells and bones. What had been meadow was now murky water. What had been home was now memory. The people who survived this period of transformation were resilient and adaptable in the deepest ways. They didn't disappear or vanish from the historical record entirely. Instead, they reorganized themselves, established new communities further inland progressively. They developed new subsistence strategies suited to the forests and grasslands of the interior regions. Some probably moved north, following the receding ice sheets and the animal migrations that came with them seasonally. Others stayed in the Gulf region, adapting to the new coastline and learning. They learned how to live with mangrove swamps and barrier islands and coastal lagoons. They learned to live with these new environments rather than the open shelf they had known. They were still hunting and fishing, still trading across networks, still building communities. But they were doing it in a different landscape, with different resources, different challenges and opportunities. The world they knew had literally been washed away permanently, but they survived it nonetheless. They adapted in extraordinary ways, they continued their cultures and traditions, and the cities and settlements that their descendants would build in the coming millennia would be built on the foundations. These were built on the hard-won knowledge and resilience that their ancestors had gained. The people who survived the Great Melt learned to navigate new realities with skill and creativity. They learned where the new fish spawned in the changed rivers. They found new routes for trade that followed the new waterways. They discovered new plants that thrived in the marshes. They followed the deer and elk as those animals moved inland. Communities that had been separated by the rising waters sometimes found each other again through trade networks. Knowledge of the old places passed down through stories and songs, even as people adapted to the new world. Oral histories kept alive the memory of what was lost while celebrating what endured. The story of the Great Melt is also the story of how human societies respond to catastrophic environmental change. It's a story that should resonate with us today, when we face our own climate challenges and rising sea levels. Our modern era brings its own version of the Great Melt, different in its causes perhaps, but similar in its effects. But that's for another time in our story, because there's still more to explore and understand, and as the waters settled and stabilised, the people of the old Gulf region entered a new phase. This new phase involved innovation, expansion, and the building of complex societies. These societies would persist for thousands of years until that next great upheaval came. The flood was a crucible that tested human resilience and revealed the capacity for adaptation that our species possesses. For now, let's sit with the image of those ancient peoples watching their world transform. They were adapting to the rising waters, finding new homes and new ways. They were living in a landscape that no longer looked like anything their ancestors would recognize or remember. It's a reminder that change, sometimes even catastrophic change, is part of the human story fundamentally. And the way we respond to it, the ways we adapt and rebuild and find meaning in new circumstances, that's what defines us as a species deeply. It's what makes us human. The people of the old Gulf Shelf lived through one of history's greatest transformations, and they emerged from it changed, dispersed, but still alive. Still human in every way. Still able to build, to create, to pass down stories and knowledge. The knowledge passed to the next generation through oral tradition and example. And as we move forward in our history, that's the thread we're going to follow. It's the thread of human resilience and adaptation in the face of a world that refuses to stay still. The waters have settled now. The immediate crisis of the melt has passed, but the legacy of those drowned lands and displaced peoples will continue to echo. This legacy will resonate through the centuries and millennia. That legacy will shape the cultures and civilizations that emerge in Mesoamerica and around the Gulf. It will influence how people think about their relationship with the sea, with the land, with the forces of nature that can reshape their world. These are forces that can transform the entire geographic layout in just a few generations' time. People might develop water rituals and spiritual practices to honour the sea. They might tell stories warning against greed or hubris in the face of nature. They might create cosmologies where water plays a central role in creation and destruction. The Meltwater Pulse was so catastrophic that it imprinted itself on the human consciousness in lasting ways. Some of these scattered peoples will reunite in new forms, creating confederacies and alliances based on shared origins. Some will diverge further, creating distinct cultures and traditions and languages over time. Some will develop agricultural practices that let them settle in one place for the first time in history. They will build permanent villages and eventually complex societies. But all of them will carry with them the knowledge of what happened when the ice melted. They will remember when the seas rose so dramatically. They will tell stories about it repeatedly to their children. They will remember it in their bones and spirits. And those memories, transformed and reshaped through the generations, will eventually become the myths and legends. The myths and legends of their descendants far in the future. Myths about old cities lost to the flood and drowned beneath waves forever. Myths about ancestors who lived in a golden age before the waters came. Myths about gods and spirits who controlled the tides and the weather and the catastrophic rise of the sea. These spirits controlled the fate of human beings and their destinies. Perhaps the flood myths that appear in cultures around the world are echoes of this time. Perhaps they remember when the world changed and people had to learn to live differently. The memory endures even as the details transform. In the next part of our story, we're going to see what emerges from this period of upheaval and loss. We'll explore the adaptation and reorganization of these societies over time. We're going to look at how human societies reorganized themselves completely. They developed new technologies, new ways of living that would eventually lead to the complex civilizations of Mesoamerica flourishing. We're going to talk about how the descendants of those people displaced by the rising waters eventually became the Maya, the Olmec, and other great civilizations. We're going to explore the archaeological evidence for these developments and what it tells us about how human beings respond to crisis. Crisis and transformation bring out human resilience and innovation in profound ways. The survivors of the Great Melt carried with them valuable knowledge. They knew how to adapt quickly. They knew how to create new social structures. They knew how to maintain cultural identity even when forced to move. These were the skills that would allow their descendants to build some of the greatest civilizations in human history. But for now, as you drift off to sleep, hold on to this image, the slow, inexorable rise of the waters, generation after generation watching their homeland disappear beneath the waves completely. The need to adapt, to move, to find new meaning in a landscape that no longer feels like home anymore. Elder grandparents teaching young people about the old places even as they walked toward new lands. Children being born in locations that didn't exist when their grandparents were young. Think of the grief that must have accompanied each migration. Think of the stories that grew up around the lost lands. Think of how the water became a symbol of change itself. The rising seas were not just a physical phenomenon, but a spiritual crisis that demanded explanation. The people living through this needed to make sense of what was happening around them. They turned to their spiritual leaders and storytellers for understanding. The narratives that emerged from this period would echo through the ages. It's a story of loss, yes, but also of resilience and survival. It's a story about how even in the face of forces that seem too large to overcome, human beings find ways to endure. They find ways to continue forward despite obstacles. They find ways to build something new out of the ruins of what was lost. Imagine the stories told around fires about the drowned lands and lost cities. Imagine songs composed to remember the names of lost places and forgotten people. Imagine ceremonies created to honor the ancestors who were buried under the sea. These rituals and stories would become the foundation for everything that came after. They would transform grief into meaning and loss into wisdom. The people who survived the rising waters didn't just adapt physically. They adapted spiritually and emotionally as well. They created new narratives that made sense of their world. And that story, that capacity for resilience and adaptation, is one of the most fundamentally human things we possess. It's a story that has played out again and again across human history repeatedly. And it's a story that connects us to these old peoples. These peoples lived on the Gulf Shelf 10 or 12,000 years ago. Their struggle is our struggle too. Building sustainable communities in the face of environmental change follows the same impulse. It's the impulse that drove those old peoples to adapt. We are, in a very real sense, their descendants, not just genetically, though that may be true in many cases, but spiritually and culturally in profound ways. We inherit their story and their memory. We inherit their struggle and their perseverance. We inherit their resilience in the face of uncertainty. And as we face our own moment of environmental crisis and transformation, it's worth remembering that our ancestors faced even more dramatic changes. They found ways not just to survive, but to eventually thrive and build magnificent societies. They built civilizations that lasted for thousands of years. They created art and culture and meaning from their lives. They passed down knowledge that would shape the world for thousands of years to come, and they did all of this in the aftermath of one of the most dramatic environmental transformations. This transformation was one of the most dramatic the world has ever seen in its entire history. That's the power of the human story and its resilience. That's what makes it worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down to the next generation. As they drift off to sleep, they can dream of old waters and lost cities. They can dream of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of a world that refuses to stay still and unchanging. The people of the Gulf Shelf didn't give up. They didn't despair into immobility. They adapted, they survived, they eventually flourished, and that same capacity lives in us. We carry their genes and their story. We inherit their resilience whether we know it or not. When scientists first looked beneath the Gulf of Mexico, they didn't know what they were searching for. but they knew something was down there. The story of how we discovered evidence of that submerged world is itself a kind of mystery, one that unfolded over decades as technology got better and researchers pieced together fragments of geological evidence. Modern underwater archaeology uses tools that would have seemed like pure science fiction just 50 years ago. Sonar systems that can map the sea floor with extraordinary precision, revealing features hidden under hundreds of feet of saltwater and sediment. These sophisticated sonar systems bounce sound waves off the ocean bottom and create three-dimensional images that show topography and geological formations invisible to the human eye. The technology evolved through military applications during the Cold War, but eventually became available to academic researchers and government agencies studying marine environments. Coastal archaeologists now use side-scan sonar and multi-beam sonar systems that can detect objects as small as automobiles on the seafloor and map entire undersea landscapes with remarkable fidelity. Side-scan sonar transmits sound waves perpendicular to travel, creating acoustic imagery that reveals seafloor features. Multi-beam sonar transmits multiple beams simultaneously, creating highly detailed bathymetric maps. The combination of these technologies has revolutionized marine archaeology, allowing researchers to survey square miles of seafloor in days or weeks, finding potential sites that might otherwise take decades to locate. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, has conducted extensive surveys of the Gulf floor as part of resource management, and these surveys accidentally became archaeological gold mines, mapping features that told stories of a very different landscape than what we see today. What they found was a Gulf of Mexico that had been utterly transformed by rising seas, a process that happened not gradually but in phases, with periods of rapid change that would have been catastrophic for any human populations living in the coastal plains. The evidence came in layers, both literally and figuratively, from multiple scientific disciplines working independently, but arriving at the same conclusions about the timing and severity of these environmental changes. Geologists studying seafloor cores found submerged river channels cut into what is now the ocean floor, channels that had carried water and sediment during times when the Gulf was a very different environment. These channels functioned as major drainage systems thousands of years ago when the landscape configuration was radically different. These weren't small creeks or minor waterways. Some were major river systems, hundreds of feet deep, carved into the continental shelf when sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. The channels show clear signs of erosion patterns, consistent with sustained water flow over extended periods, evidence that these were permanent features of the landscape. Using detailed sonar mapping, researchers could trace these old channels across the seafloor, seeing them as if the water had just drained away, revealing roads and rivers from a lost world. Some channels extend for dozens of miles across the continental shelf, visible on sonar images as dark linear features against the lighter background of surrounding sediment. The precision of modern sonar allows researchers to measure channel width, depth, and branching patterns that reveal information about the water volume they once carried. The most dramatic evidence came from a discovery off the coast of Alabama, where researchers found what can only be described as an underwater forest, cypress trees that had been preserved in place for more than 60,000 years. These weren't just scattered logs or fragments, they were actual tree stumps still rooted in what had once been solid ground, now lying under nearly 200 feet of water. The wood had been preserved by the oxygen-poor environment of the seafloor, an accident of chemistry that turned the ocean bottom into a kind of underwater tomb, where normal decomposition processes essentially stopped. This preservation is similar to the way peat bogs preserve organic material on land, creating anaerobic conditions that prevent bacterial growth and decay. Scientists could see the rings in these old cypress trees, rings that recorded year after year of growth, evidence that these trees had lived and thrived in a world very different from the saltwater Gulf we know today. Each ring represents a single year of growth, and variations in ring width reflect climate conditions during that year, providing a detailed record of environmental history. Dendrochronologists can extract cores from these preserved trees and read their annual growth patterns going back thousands of years. What makes this discovery so profound is not just that trees were preserved, but what their presence tells us about when the flooding happened and how complete it was. Cypress trees grow in freshwater and brackish water environments, in swamps and shallow waters along coastlines and rivers, where they develop specialized root systems adapted to waterlogged soil. Finding them on the deep sea floor means that entire ecosystems were submerged. Freshwater systems that had existed on land were inundated all at once, and the trees had nowhere to survive the sudden salinity change. The flooding wasn't a gradual encroachment that allowed ecosystems to migrate and adapt over generations. It was fast enough to trap living forests and preserve them in their final positions. The Bald Cypress forest off Alabama represents what may be the largest ancient freshwater forest ecosystem ever discovered underwater, suggesting that the landscape beneath modern waters supported extensive woodlands and diverse plant communities. These cypress forests would have been part of a larger ecological system that included freshwater lakes, streams, and the kinds of wetland habitats cypress trees require. The preservation of these trees allows researchers to study not just the trees themselves, but the entire ecosystem that disappeared beneath the waves. The cypress stumps found in these underwater forests range from a few feet to over 30 feet in diameter, indicating mature, old-growth trees that had been establishing themselves for centuries. Some of these cypress trees show evidence of being burned or damaged before being submerged, suggesting that human activity, particularly the use of fire to clear land or manage vegetation, occurred in these forests. The charcoal deposits associated with these burned trees have been radiocarbon dated, revealing that humans were actively using fire in these cypress forests between 10,000 and 9,000 years ago, a clear indication of human occupation and land management. Pollen cores extracted from sediment layers near the cypress forests show alternating layers of cypress pollen with pollen from oak, pine, and other terrestrial plants, indicating a mixed forest ecosystem adapted to the wetland environment of the continental shelf. The sequence of these pollen layers provides a detailed record of how the vegetation changed over time as climate shifted and water levels rose. Off the coast of Florida, maritime archaeologists have found numerous submerged archaeological sites, places where human activity has left traces now underwater. Some of these sites are relatively recent, from Native American populations that lived along coasts thousands of years ago, but the pattern is always the same. Evidence of human habitation exists at depths that suggest it was on dry land during some period in the past. Underwater explorers have documented old middens, the refuse heaps left by prehistoric peoples eating shellfish and other marine resources, now sitting on the ocean bottom at depths indicating submerged shorelines. These archaeological deposits contain shells, bone fragments, stone tools, and charcoal from old fires, all preserved by being buried under sediment and protected from normal weathering processes. The analysis of these middens provides crucial information about diet, settlement patterns, and the timeline of human occupation in regions now submerged. There's a site called Ray Hole Spring where researchers have found artifacts and evidence of human activity, demonstrating that human populations utilized these freshwater springs, even as water levels were changing. Ray Hole Spring is located off the Florida coast, and the spring itself would have created a local freshwater source in a brackish or saltwater environment, making it an attractive location for human settlement and resource procurement. The freshwater from such springs would have been essential for drinking and cooking, making these locations natural focal points for human habitation. The geological context clearly shows that this location was on dry land, and then was flooded, with archaeological evidence suggesting human occupation at specific points in time before the flooding occurred. Researchers working at Ray Hole Spring have recovered stone tools, including scrapers and cutting implements used in food preparation and hide working, indicating that the site was regularly occupied by people with sophisticated toolkits. The organic material found at the site, when subjected to radiocarbon dating, consistently shows human activity between 11,000 and 9,000 years ago, precisely the period when sea levels were rising most rapidly. The preservation of these materials underwater provides a window into a world where human settlements existed at what is now 300 feet below the Gulf surface. The depth alone tells part of the story, but when you combine it with radiocarbon dating and geological analysis, the timing becomes clear. The flooding happened during the period we know as the early Holocene, when global sea levels were rising but doing so in specific dramatic phases. The early Holocene spans roughly from 12,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago, a period when melting glaciers returned enormous volumes of water to Earth's oceans. During this period, sea levels rose on average about 100 feet, but this rise wasn't evenly distributed across time. Instead, it occurred in several rapid pulses separated by periods of relative stability. The most dramatic of these pulses, called the Younger Dryas termination, saw sea levels rise as much as 50 to 60 feet in a few centuries, an almost incomprehensible rate of change. Human populations living in coastal areas during this time would have experienced this as a genuine crisis, watching as their lands were progressively inundated. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from studying sinkholes in the Gulf floor, formations that appear as circular depressions on sonar maps, sometimes hundreds of feet deep. These sinkholes formed during times when the water table was lower, when groundwater dissolved limestone beneath the surface, creating chambers that eventually collapsed into the sinkholes we see today. Sinkholes are characteristic features of limestone regions where slightly acidic groundwater dissolves the rock and creates voids. The dissolution process takes thousands of years, but given enough time, fresh water gradually enlarges underground cavities in the limestone bedrock. Once these voids become too large, the roof collapses, leaving a circular depression that can persist for thousands of years. The presence of these intact sinkholes on the modern seafloor tells us they formed when that area was above water, when rainfall and groundwater could erode limestone in the normal way sinkholes form. The sonar images show these sinkholes with striking clarity, circular features that stand out from the surrounding relatively flat sea floor, making them unmistakable in underwater surveys. Once the sea rose and covered everything, new sinkholes stopped forming because the chemistry changed. Salt water doesn't create sinkholes the same way fresh water does. Salt water lacks the acidity of fresh water and interacts with limestone through different chemical processes that don't lead to the same type of dissolution and cavity formation. So we have a kind of geological timer. Sinkhole formation stopped in these areas at specific points in time, and that timing correlates with when sea levels rose dramatically. By studying which sinkholes were actively forming and which had reached their final form, geologists can estimate the timing of when flooding covered that particular area. Some sinkholes show clear evidence of containing freshwater-adapted sediments and fossil organisms, indicating they were filled with freshwater lakes before the saltwater invasion. The study of fossil diatoms and other microscopic organisms found in sinkhole sediments provides additional dating information and confirms the environmental history of these underwater depressions. Indigenous peoples living in the Americas have oral traditions that are quite specific about great floods, stories passed down through generations, accounts that describe water rising and swallowing the land. The Natchez people of the Mississippi Delta had creation stories about the earth being flooded and reformed, stories that described the water rising over days or weeks, submerging mountains and valleys, and transforming the landscape entirely. The Karankawa people of the Texas coast had traditions about a time when the waters rose, flooding lands their ancestors had inhabited, forcing them to retreat to higher ground and find new settlements. The A's people of the Florida coast similarly maintain traditions of lands now beneath the sea. These aren't just vague myths. Many of them contain geographic details that align with what we know about the actual coastlines that existed at specific times in the past. Some traditions mention islands becoming peninsulas or mainland becoming islands, changes from sea level fluctuations. The Oconee legend describes a period when people could walk from mainland to islands, possible only if sea levels were lower. There's a tendency in academic circles to dismiss oral traditions as merely mythological, but increasingly researchers recognize that these stories often encode real events, particularly catastrophic events that would have been seared into cultural memory. A flood that destroyed your world and killed your people doesn't get forgotten. It gets told and retold until it becomes part of your nation's founding story. Anthropologists studying oral traditions have found that stories about major environmental catastrophes are preserved with striking accuracy across generations, maintaining specific details about timing and geography that turn out to match the geological record. What's fascinating is that some of these stories describe flooding as happening over multiple stages, not all at once, which aligns with what the geology shows us. The rise in sea level from the last ice age to today wasn't a single event but a series of them. Periods of rapid rise interrupted by periods of relative stability. The multiple pulses of sea level rise would have been experienced by coastal populations as repeated crises, waves of displacement and migration as the shoreline moved progressively inland. This pattern matches the structure of several indigenous flood narratives, which describe the water coming back, then retreating slightly, then coming back higher, eventually to devastating effect. Now the scientific story of catastrophic flooding in this region has a hero, though he was regarded as somewhat of a crank for many years, a geologist named J. Harlan Bretz, who studied the landscapes of the Pacific Northwest and proposed something radical, that catastrophic floods had shaped the landscape in ways that conventional geology couldn't explain. In the 1920s, Bretz looked at the channeled scablands of Washington state and saw evidence of floods on an almost unimaginable scale. Floods that had carved valleys, moved boulders the size of houses, and rearranged entire landscapes in what must have been a very short period of time. The channeled scablands cover thousands of square miles and show patterns of erosion that seemed impossible according to the geological understanding of that era. The geological establishment laughed at him. Floods on that scale seemed impossible, outside the bounds of what geology said should happen. Bretz spent decades defending his ideas, gathering evidence, making detailed maps, and patiently explaining his work while his colleagues dismissed him as someone with an overactive imagination. Eventually, as more evidence accumulated and other geologists independently confirmed his observations, the geological community accepted that his catastrophic flooding hypothesis was correct. But he was right. Eventually the evidence was undeniable, and it emerged that enormous floods had indeed reshaped the landscape, floods of a type most geologists hadn't considered seriously before. These floods, now called the Missoula floods, occurred at the end of the last ice age when glacial ice dams suddenly failed, releasing titanic volumes of water. The relevance to the Gulf of Mexico is that Bretz opened up a new way of thinking about Earth's history, one that acknowledges that truly catastrophic events are possible, that they leave signatures in the landscape, and that we should look for evidence of them rather than assuming they couldn't happen. Applied to the Gulf region, this thinking led researchers to look more carefully at the evidence of rapid sea level rise, the submerged landscapes, and the way those sinkholes and old river channels formed. What emerged was a picture of an ancient coast that had experienced multiple episodes of rapid inundation, times when sea levels rose fast enough that the human populations living there would have experienced it not as a gradual shift but as an encroaching disaster. Water that came back a little higher each year, then suddenly much higher. The evidence for these rapid pulses comes from studying marine sediment cores, layers of mud and sand that accumulated on the ocean floor during different periods. When sea levels rise rapidly, the sediment deposited shows distinctive patterns different from sediment deposited during stable periods. Geologists can also detect what are called transgressive surfaces, boundaries between different sediment types that mark the edge of advancing seawater. These surfaces appear across wide areas of the Gulf floor and indicate times when the shoreline moved dramatically, submerging vast areas in geological instants. The study of these surfaces has allowed researchers to identify at least 3 major rapid sea level rise events during the early Holocene, each separated by periods of relative stability lasting a few centuries. The combination of all this evidence, the sonar maps, the preserved cypress forests, the submerged archaeological sites, the oral traditions, the sinkhole formations, creates a compelling picture of the Gulf's past that's radically different from what we see now. Multibeam sonar has been particularly revolutionary in this regard, allowing researchers to create bathymetric maps that show seafloor topography with the kind of detail previously available only for land areas. These maps reveal underwater versions of river valleys, ridgelines, and basin formations that perfectly mirror what you would see on a topographic map of terrestrial landscapes. The resolution is now good enough that archaeologists can identify features that might indicate human structures or settlements on the former seafloor. Some features show geometric regularities that might indicate human construction, though much more work is needed to identify them as archaeological sites rather than natural formations. If you could have stood on the continental shelf of the Gulf of Mexico 15,000 years ago, you would have been looking at vast grasslands and forests, river systems flowing from what is now inland toward a coastline that was hundreds of miles farther out into the Gulf than it is today. The temperature would have been colder, the landscape dotted with megafauna that are now extinct, the climate very different from what we experience now. Mastodons and woolly mammoths would have grazed these grasslands, along with giant ground sloths and saber-toothed cats that hunted them. The continental shelf would have been teeming with freshwater and brackish water lakes, with forests of cypress and other species adapted to waterlogged soils. As time passed, the climate began warming. The ice sheets that covered much of North America started to melt, and water poured into the oceans at rates that caused sea levels to rise faster than at any other point in human history. The thermal maximum, the warmest period in the early Holocene, created a climate feedback loop where melting accelerated as the atmosphere warmed. The Laurentide ice sheet, which once covered much of North America from the Arctic to the Great Lakes, retreated northward, and as it did, it released enormous volumes of meltwater. Proglacial lakes, vast temporary lakes formed at the edge of retreating glaciers, eventually drained catastrophically into the oceans. These lakes sometimes contained more fresh water than all the Great Lakes combined. Water discharged in torrential flows. Some drainage events released water equivalent to annual flow of all rivers on Earth today, raising global sea levels in human-scale timescales. The sea level rise driven by this meltwater wasn't evenly distributed across the world. Some areas experienced more dramatic changes than others due to the complex effects of glacial isostasy, the rebounding of the Earth's crust as the weight of ice sheets was removed. Areas that had been covered by ice sheets were still rebounding upwards centuries after the ice had melted, while coastal areas far from the ice sheets experienced more dramatic relative sea level rise because the ocean water was flowing into their basins while their land wasn't rising as quickly. For the people living on these plains, watching as the water crept inland year after year, the experience would have been apocalyptic, a slow-motion catastrophe that accelerated over generations until whole regions were transformed into inland seas. They would have seen their sacred places disappear beneath the waves, would have been forced to migrate, to abandon the lands where their ancestors were buried and where they had harvested food for countless generations. Archaeological evidence shows that human populations retreated inland systematically as the water advanced, leaving behind artifacts and settlements at progressively higher elevations, a pattern that speaks to an organized, deliberate response to the rising waters. The loss of habitat would have been accompanied by changes in food availability, as freshwater systems transformed into brackish environments and marine ecosystems. Shellfish that had thrived in freshwater and brackish waters disappeared as salinity increased. The megafauna that had been hunted by coastal peoples went extinct or migrated northward. The plant communities changed dramatically. The migrations triggered by this flooding would have created population pressures inland, as coastal peoples moved to already occupied territories. This influx of refugees from the coasts would have led to competition for resources, territorial conflicts, and the emergence of larger, more centralized groups as a means of managing population pressure and controlling access to remaining resources. Some scholars theorize that this period of stress drove cultural innovations, including more sophisticated social organization, improved agricultural knowledge, and the development of new tools and weapons. This is where the underwater city itself fits into the narrative, because it's not just a random archaeological curiosity, but part of a much larger story about how environmental change has shaped human history. The city, if it exists as described in various accounts, would represent a moment in time before this transformation occurred, a place where people had adapted to living in the Gulf region and built structures that would eventually find themselves underwater. Some accounts describe a settlement of impressive sophistication, with buildings, defensive structures, and a population organized in ways suggesting centralized authority and specialized economic roles. If such a place did exist, it would have been one of the earliest known examples of ancient complex settlement in North America, predating by thousands of years the better-known civilizations of the Mississippi Valley and the Southwest. The people of this lost city, if it existed, would have witnessed the beginning of the Great Transgression, the moment when the waters began their inexorable advance, and would have been among the first to face the choice of standing and fighting, a losing battle against the rising seas, or joining the migrations inland that characterized this period. But before we explore that, we need to understand something crucial about evidence and proof in archaeology, and how scientists distinguish between what they can show and what they're still investigating. You see, the Gulf of Mexico has been mapped extensively, but mapping isn't the same as excavating, and the difference between what we can see on a sonar image and what we can definitively prove about human occupation is significant. Let me explain how that works and what it means for the city beneath the Gulf. Archaeologists follow strict protocols for identifying potential sites. A curious geometric pattern on a sonar map might be a human structure, or might simply be a natural formation created by currents or sediment deposition. The only way to definitively determine which is to actually visit the site, collect physical samples, and study them in detail. For underwater sites in the Gulf, this means organising expensive expeditions with submersibles or diving teams, equipment costs that run into millions of dollars, and risks that limit how much work can be done. Additionally, the Gulf's waters are not always conducive to underwater archaeology. The murky water, the strong currents, and the depths involved make it extraordinarily difficult to conduct thorough excavations. Many sonar anomalies have been identified and carefully documented, but without physical investigation, their origins remain unknown and debated. The scientific process demands that we remain skeptical of dramatic claims until they are supported by hard evidence, a caution that protects us from false narratives but also means that certain mysteries may remain unsolved for decades or longer. So we've traced this submerged city beneath the Gulf of Mexico, walked through its streets in our minds, felt the weight of its loss. But here's what keeps archaeologists awake at night. This wasn't alone. This was just one settlement, one place we happened to notice. Beneath the Gulf's waters and across the continental shelves surrounding North America lie potentially thousands of other sites. Thousands of communities vanished when the ocean rose. Entire civilizations pressed into the sediment, waiting in darkness for someone to find them. The scale is almost incomprehensible. When we talk about early human settlement in the Americas, we're talking about a coastline that's completely gone. The ancient shoreline stretched hundreds of miles from what's now Texas to Florida to the Caribbean. Every few miles along that coast, people had settled. They built villages where the rivers met the sea. They created fishing camps and trading posts. They carved out lives in the rich transition zones where freshwater and saltwater mixed, where resources were abundant. All of it is underwater now. Think about what that means for our understanding of the earliest Americans. For decades, the prevailing model focused on inland migration. People came across the Bering Strait land bridge, the story went, and moved inland, following rivers and animal herds into the continental interior. But that narrative was incomplete. It missed the entire coastal dimension of human settlement. It ignored the possibility that some of the first Americans were sailors and fishermen, people who hugged the coastlines and spread down the western and eastern shores. The underwater archaeology community has been quietly revolutionizing this picture for the last 20 years. They found evidence of these coastal populations in places where we could still see them. In California, researchers discovered middens and tool sites on the Channel Islands that proved humans were there over 13,000 years ago. These weren't inland people who wandered to the coast. They were maritime people, comfortable on the water, harvesting marine resources. Similar findings emerged along the Pacific coast of South America. But here's the frustrating part. We can only study the populations that survived above the modern sea level. Beneath the waves, the evidence is sparse and scattered. We find occasional artifacts. A tool here, a flaked stone there, brought up by fishing nets or dredging operations. We catch glimpses of wooden structures when the sediment shifts, but most of it remains completely unknown. The Gulf City is remarkable not because it's unique, but because it's one of the few we've managed to detect at all, and detection depends on luck, technology, and the right combination of circumstances. You need sonar that can see through water and mud. You need divers willing to descend to crushing depths. You need archaeologists who believe the search is worth the effort and the expense. You need funding in an era when universities would rather invest in trendy research than in the slow, expensive work of finding drowned worlds. But the potential is enormous. Somewhere beneath the murky waters of the Gulf there might be preserved wooden structures with carvings still visible. There might be pottery workshops where clay vessels were made. There might be burial sites with human remains that could tell us about diet, disease, and genetics. There might be boat-building sites showing how ancient peoples mastered the ocean. The technologies are improving. Three-dimensional sonar mapping is becoming more sophisticated. Remotely operated vehicles can explore deeper with better cameras and sampling equipment. We're getting better at reading the geological record of submarine canyons and ancient deltas. Archaeologists are developing new techniques for dating organic material found underwater. But the work is only beginning. The Gulf of Mexico alone covers about 100,000 square miles. If we devoted significant resources to systematic underwater survey, how many sites might we find? How many settlements might emerge from the mud? The answer is probably hundreds, maybe more, and the implications would reshape everything we think we know about the peopling of the Americas. This is where things get really interesting, because the Gulf City story connects to a much broader global pattern. We're not talking about a unique phenomenon. Around the world, there are drowned landscapes that held human civilizations. Take Doggerland, for instance. Doggerland was a vast landmass that connected what's now Britain to continental Europe. It was a tundra landscape in the last ice age, then gradually became a rich temperate forest with grasslands and wetlands. People lived there. They hunted and fished and raised livestock. They moved freely across this enormous territory that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Then the ice melted. The sea level rose rapidly, and within 1,000 years, Doggerland was completely submerged beneath the North Sea. Today, it's gone. We only know it existed because of submarine surveys and archaeological finds on the ocean floor. Fishermen occasionally drag up ancient tools and bone tools from what was once dry land. Scientists have reconstructed what Doggerland looked like using geology and ancient DNA evidence. It was a thriving landscape that supported thousands of people, and then it was simply swallowed by the sea. Off the coast of India lies another drowned world. Dwarka, also called the Lost City of Krishna, was supposedly built where the ocean now stands. According to ancient texts, it was a fabulous port city built by the deity Krishna. For centuries, people thought it was purely mythological. Then, archaeologists started finding evidence of human settlements on the seafloor. They discovered ancient structures, pottery, and artifacts at depths that would have been above sea level thousands of years ago. The city might not have been built by a god, but it was definitely built by people, and it's definitely underwater now. In Southeast Asia, beneath the waters of the South China Sea and the Gulf of Thailand, lie the remains of settlements from when the coastline was very different. These were places connected by maritime trade routes that spanned thousands of miles. The sea level changes weren't as dramatic as in the north, but they were significant enough to transform the landscape. Entire trading networks vanished beneath rising tides. These examples matter because they show us that the Gulf City isn't some isolated mystery. It's part of a global pattern. Wherever you look on Earth, wherever the sea level rose at the end of the last ice age, there are drowned landscapes with human remains. The scale of human loss is staggering. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions, living in coastal zones that now lie underwater. Their settlements, their tools, their art, their everyday lives are sealed beneath the sediment. The question isn't whether these places existed. The question is whether we have the will to find them. And that question leads us back to what this means for how we understand early human history. For a long time, archaeology operated with a particular bias. We studied the sites that were easy to find and easy to dig. We had detailed maps of inland settlements because they weren't underwater. We had complex narratives about inland migration and settlement patterns because that's where we could dig. We naturally formed models of the past based on what was visible to us. But visibility is partly about luck. It's partly about what the ocean chose to preserve. It's partly about what we chose to look for. The truth is that a massive portion of early human settlement in the Americas was maritime. We know this from ethnographic accounts of early contact. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they encountered people who were master seafarers. The indigenous peoples of the Caribbean and the Gulf Coast were skilled navigators. They built sophisticated boats. They travelled long distances over open water. These weren't people who had just recently learned to sail. These were people with generations of maritime knowledge embedded in their cultures. That knowledge had to come from somewhere. It had to develop over thousands of years, which means the coastal migration and maritime adaptation had to have been happening for a very long time. The settlement patterns we see at contact reflected deep historical processes stretching back far into the past. The underwater settlements in the Gulf supported and enabled the societies that Europeans encountered. This connects to another debate that's been simmering in archaeology for decades, the Solutrean hypothesis. The Solutrean hypothesis proposes that people from southwestern Europe actually crossed the Atlantic during the last ice age and contributed to the settlement of North America. The evidence cited includes similarities between Solutrean stone tools from France and tools found in North America that date to roughly the same period. It's controversial, and many archaeologists reject it. The main genetic evidence suggests that most early Americans descended from Asian populations, but the hypothesis raises important questions about what's possible, about maritime capabilities, about how much we don't know about the early peopling of the Americas. What if there were actually multiple migration routes? What if people arrived from Europe and from Asia? What if the settlements we find underwater would settle this debate once and for all? The thing is, if we found European genetic markers in the ancient remains of the Gulf City, It would rewrite everything. If we found tools that showed clear transatlantic contact, it would change the entire narrative, and we'll never know unless we look. This is partly why some archaeologists are quietly excited about the Gulf City and what it represents. It's not just about this one settlement, it's about what finding it proves, that underwater settlements can be found, that techniques work, that the investment is worth it. Once you establish that one drowned site is accessible and salvageable, you make the case for finding others, and each additional site you find fills in more of the picture. Each artifact recovered tells you something about ancient maritime people. Each dating result pins down another timeline. Over time, the underwater picture becomes clearer. The coastal migration theory is gaining serious traction in academic circles now, and the Gulf City is part of why. Here's the basic idea. Instead of picturing the first Americans as primarily inland people, picture them as coastal people. Picture them arriving by boat, then spreading down the coastlines of North and South America. They would have followed the shoreline south, exploring each major estuary and bay. They would have established settlements wherever resources were abundant. They would have created trading networks connecting distant communities. They would have developed sophisticated maritime knowledge and technologies. Over time, some of their descendants would move inland, carrying maritime technology and cultural knowledge with them. Others would remain coastal, becoming the ancestors of the seafaring peoples Europeans encountered. This model actually fits better with a lot of evidence that didn't fit well with the traditional inland migration model. It explains why the earliest confirmed sites in the Americas seem to have a maritime component. It explains why early Americans showed such sophisticated knowledge of ocean resources. It explains the widespread distribution of early settlements, which seems to follow coastline patterns more closely than inland river valleys. And it explains why so many early American cultures had such strong maritime traditions. The underwater sites are crucial to proving this theory because they would show us the settlements themselves. They would show us the boats and fishing technology. They would show us the exchange networks. They would show us the day-to-day life of coastal peoples. Right now, we're trying to reconstruct the entire coastal settlement pattern from the tiny fraction that survived above water. It's like trying to understand a complete city from finding a few artifacts in a suburban yard. The underwater archaeology of the Gulf of Mexico represents an enormous untapped archive of human history, and the question is whether we're going to invest in opening that archive. The technical challenges are real but surmountable. The main issue is depth and pressure. The Gulf can reach depths of over 3,000 feet in some places, but the ancient shoreline was only in shallower zones, mostly under 200 to 400 feet of water. That's manageable. Modern submarine technology can reach those depths. Remotely operated vehicles can map and survey at those depths. Divers can descend to those depths, though with significant training and equipment. The sediment is another challenge. The Gulf bottom is covered with soft mud and silt. Over thousands of years, settlements get buried deep. You can't just dive down and pick up artifacts. You need to carefully excavate, remove sediment, preserve everything. You need specialized diving equipment that can handle the pressure and the cold and the poor visibility. You need teams trained in underwater archaeology. You need time and money. Here's where it gets sobering. A single major underwater excavation can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. A really comprehensive survey of even a small section of the ancient Gulf shoreline might cost millions. Universities have those budgets, but they're not unlimited. Research funding agencies face competition from hundreds of worthy projects. Underwater archaeology competes for attention and resources with every other field, which means the pace of discovery is slower than it could be. The future of underwater archaeology in the Gulf depends on several factors converging. First, there needs to be continued technological development. Three-dimensional sonar mapping is improving rapidly. Autonomous underwater vehicles are becoming more sophisticated. Remote sensing techniques are advancing. As the technology improves and becomes cheaper, underwater surveys become more feasible. Second, there needs to be sustained funding. This might come from government agencies interested in maritime history. It might come from universities whose archaeologists are committed to this work. It might come from private foundations interested in supporting groundbreaking research. It might come from public crowdfunding campaigns that engage people in the search for these lost worlds. Third, there needs to be continued political and cultural support. Indigenous nations in the Gulf region are increasingly interested in these submerged ancestral sites. They want to be involved in the research and have a say in how discoveries are interpreted and preserved. This is appropriate and important. These are their ancestors. The Gulf City was home to their people. The underwater settlements belong to their heritage. Collaboration with indigenous communities isn't just ethically right, it makes the archaeology better. Indigenous knowledge of the region, of oral histories, of cultural connections to the landscape can guide research in productive directions. Fourth, there needs to be connection to broader scientific questions. Why does the Gulf City matter? It matters because it reveals the resilience and adaptability of human coastal communities. It matters because it shows how environmental change displaces human populations. It matters because it demonstrates maritime capabilities in ancient times. It matters because it changes our understanding of early American settlement. It matters because it's part of the story of how humans adapted to and lived in challenging environments. All these reasons give underwater Gulf archaeology relevance beyond academic interest. They connect it to bigger stories about human history and human adaptation. Which brings us to the reflective part. What does the Gulf City mean? What does it mean that there's an entire lost world beneath the ocean? It means that human history is vastly larger than the small fraction we can see. It means that every landscape holds stories we've forgotten. It means that the ground beneath our feet and the water beneath the surface contain layered records of human experience. It means that what we think we know about the past is incomplete. The Gulf City is a reminder of how much we don't know. It's a prompt to humility. We study the past with the tools we have available. We form models based on the evidence we can find. But the evidence we can find depends on what's been preserved and what we've chosen to look for. Our understanding of the past is always provisional, always subject to revision when new evidence emerges. The Gulf City, and sites like it around the world, should make us comfortable with mystery. There's something beautiful about living with unsolved questions. There's something restorative about acknowledging the limits of our knowledge. The ocean keeps its secrets for millennia. And then, sometimes, we get a glimpse. We see evidence that people lived and thrived in places now underwater. We feel the weight of lost worlds pressing up from the depths. And we're reminded that beneath every landscape, beneath every city, beneath every civilization, there are older stories. There are people who came before, who built lives and communities, who solved problems and created art and loved each other. Most of them are completely forgotten. Their settlements are lost. Their names are gone. Their stories are buried beneath the sediment and the rising seas. But they were here. They lived on these lands and waters. They adapted to their world and made something of themselves. And that matters. The Gulf City mattered to the people who built it. It mattered to the people who were displaced when the waters rose. Their loss was real. Their grief was real. And now, thousands of years later, we find their artifacts and we feel a kind of connection. We feel respect for their ingenuity. We feel sadness for their loss. We feel awe at their resilience. And we realize that we're connected to them by a thin thread of human experience stretching across millennia. This is why archaeology matters. This is why we search beneath the water and the soil. This is why we preserve these stories and tell them again and again. We're trying to honor the people who came before. We're trying to recover what was lost. We're trying to understand the arc of human experience. The Gulf City sits in its submarine canyon, layered beneath centuries of sediment. Its buildings are dark and quiet. The fish swim through what were once doorways. The mud settles slowly, grain by grain. And somewhere down there, encoded in the artifacts and the architecture, are stories waiting to be read. Stories of ordinary people living ordinary lives in an extraordinary place. Stories of adaptation and survival. Stories of loss and continuity. Stories that connect the past to the present, that remind us we're part of a long human chain stretching back into the darkness. As you drift towards sleep, carrying these images with you, imagine the Gulf City resting in its deep cradle. Imagine the water above it, shifting slowly with currents and tides. Imagine the slow work of archaeology, patient and careful, gradually revealing what was hidden. Imagine the scientists and divers and students who will spend their careers learning from these submerged sites. Imagine the day when we understand the full scope of what was lost to the rising seas. And know that this knowledge is coming slowly but surely, that the underwater archive is being opened, one discovery at a time, that the people who built the Gulf City are not forgotten, even if their names are lost. Their legacy is preserved in the stones they shaped, in the settlements they built, in the ways their descendants adapted and survived. The ocean took their cities, but it also protected them. It preserved them in a kind of stasis, waiting, and we are patient enough, curious enough, determined enough to eventually find them. As the night deepens and the water rises in your mind, let these stories settle. Let them become part of the landscape of your dreams. Let the mystery of the submerged cities drift like sediment, slowly covering and preserving the day that's passed. And in the morning, remember that beneath the surface of the world, there are still wonders waiting to be discovered. There are still stories waiting to be told. There are still lost worlds waiting for someone patient and persistent enough to find them. Sleep now, knowing that human history is deeper and richer and more complex than we usually imagine. Sleep knowing that there are people who dedicate their lives to understanding what was lost.